After 5 years in prison, Pablo decides to visit the grave of his late girlfriend, but as he approaches the tombstone, something makes him go pale with shock. The drizzle seemed endless, turning the cemetery grounds into a sprawling field of mud. Pablo trudged through it, his steps heavy, the cold air carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and soaked leaves. He barely noticed. Every step he took was fueled by a bitter mix of anguish and resignation. After 5 long years behind bars, he finally had the chance to confront what remained of Paloma, a solitary grave, a quiet headstone, and the crushing weight of guilt that had haunted him since that fateful night. When his eyes finally landed on her headstone, a shiver ran down his spine. It was a simple stone, the kind that didn't seem to bow to time, with her name etched in stark white marble. Slowly, Pablo knelt, his hands trembling as they rested on the cold surface. He traced the letters of her name, reading every detail of the inscription, but then something stopped him cold. The dates. They didn't make sense. According to the headstone, Paloma had died before the accident that took her life. His fingers ran over the carved letters, as if touching them could erase the glaring error. Confusion churned within him, pushing aside the grief he thought he'd feel in this moment. Standing abruptly, his gaze darted around the cemetery, searching for answers in the heavy silence. Without wasting time, he made his way to the caretaker's shack, where he knew an elderly man often stayed. Sure enough, the man was there, hunched over a worn table, his attention on a crackling radio. "Excuse me, sir," Pablo began, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "I need to know, how long has that headstone been here?" The caretaker glanced up, his tired eyes narrowing in mild irritation. "Which headstone?" he asked gruffly. "Paloma Vieira. She's buried here." Pablo's voice faltered as he spoke her name. The old man frowned, scratching his chin as he considered. "There's no one by that name buried here. I'm sure of it." Pablo froze, disbelief washing over him. "That's impossible. I just saw her grave," he insisted, pointing back toward the spot he had visited moments earlier. The caretaker shook his head slowly. "Wait here, I'll check." After flipping through an ancient ledger for what felt like an eternity, the man looked up, his expression unchanged. "There's no Paloma Vieira in these records. Never has been." Those words hit Pablo like a punch to the gut. He tried to argue, describing the grave and the details of the headstone, but the caretaker remained firm. Desperation clawed at Pablo's chest. If Paloma wasn't buried there, where was she? And more disturbingly, who had placed a false headstone with her name on it? He returned to the grave, a feverish urgency driving him now. Questions raced through his mind. Who would do this, and why? But amidst the chaos of his thoughts, a single audacious idea began to take root. What if Paloma was still alive? It sounded absurd, but it made more sense than the idea that the past 5 years of his life had been built on a lie. By the next morning, sleepless and consumed by the mystery, Pablo knew what he had to do. If anyone could help him uncover the truth, it was Marcelo, his childhood friend and now a police officer. Despite the years and the circumstances that had come between them, Pablo trusted him. At the station, he hesitated in front of the glass doors. Memories of being treated as a criminal here weighed on him. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. Marcelo was at his desk, focused on a computer screen. When he looked up and saw Pablo, his expression shifted from surprise to cautious concern. Rising to his feet, he adjusted his belt. "Pablo, I wasn't expecting to see you. How are you?" "I've been better," Pablo admitted, his tired smile betraying the turmoil within. "I need your help. Something really strange is happening." Marcelo gestured for him to sit. "Tell me everything." As Pablo recounted the events at the cemetery, the headstone, the caretaker's denial, and the missing records, Marcelo's face darkened. The curiosity in his eyes gave way to deep concern, and Pablo could see that his friend was taking him seriously. Whatever lay ahead, Pablo knew he wasn't alone in unraveling this enigma. Something was terribly off, and both of them knew that uncovering the truth would only be the beginning of a dangerous path, full of unexpected revelations. "Are you sure about this?" Marcelo asked, leaning back in his chair, his expression tense. "Absolutely," Pablo replied, his voice firm. "None of this makes sense, Marcelo. I need to know what really happened." Marcelo fell silent for a moment, his eyes glued to the documents in front of him. It was clear he was hesitant. Digging into a situation like this, especially one involving someone as powerful as Julio Vieira, was risky. But there was something in Pablo's eyes that made him pause. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was a desperate cry. "All right," Marcelo said finally, his tone steady but wary. "I'll help you, but we have to be careful. We're dealing with some very powerful people here, and I can't risk my career without solid proof." Marcelo began digging into the police files, using his access to examine the records surrounding the accident. At first glance, everything seemed routine. The report indicated that Paloma Vieira had died in a car crash. But as he cross-referenced the data with other files, the first inconsistencies began to appear. "Look at this," Marcelo muttered, his brow furrowing. "The death certificate is incomplete. And what's even stranger, there's another document, a secondary report identifying the crash victim as Maria da Silva, not Paloma Vieira." Pablo's eyes widened, his heart racing. "What do you mean? Are you saying Paloma didn't die in that accident?" Marcelo met his gaze, his expression serious. "That's exactly what it looks like. Someone swapped the identities. And if that happened, it wasn't by accident." The words hung in the air like a ticking bomb. Marcelo knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but he also knew he couldn't turn his back on Pablo now. "I'll keep investigating," he said, his voice resolute. "But brace yourself. This goes way beyond a simple name mix-up. If Julio Vieira is involved, there's a lot more hidden beneath the surface." Pablo nodded. With each new discovery, the weight on his chest grew heavier, but alongside it, a newfound strength began to emerge. He wasn't alone in this anymore. In the hours that followed, Pablo wandered the streets of the city, revisiting places that once brought him comfort, but now felt like mere echoes of a distant past. The little cafe where he and Paloma used to spend their afternoons looked just the same, the familiar smell of fresh coffee still in the air, the old furniture unchanged. But the faces around him weren't the same, and no one seemed to remember her. Next he headed to the central square, where they'd walked together countless times at dusk. He sat on one of the benches, staring blankly at the trees swaying in the wind. That's when he noticed a man in a distant corner, his face partly hidden by a cap. There was something familiar about him. "Excuse me," Pablo began hesitantly. "You're Cesar, right?" The man slowly lifted his head. It was him, Cesar, an ex-employee of the Vieira family who had disappeared from the city years ago. He looked worn, his face etched with lines of worry. "Pablo, I can't believe it. You're out of prison," Cesar asked in a raspy voice. "Yeah, and I need answers. You worked for Julio Vieira. Tell me, Cesar, what happened to Paloma?" Cesar looked around nervously before gesturing for Pablo to sit beside him. "Listen, kid, I shouldn't be talking to you. But," he paused, letting out a heavy sigh, "Julio sent Paloma away after the accident. She was alive, but he forced her to disappear." Pablo's heart nearly stopped. Why? What was he trying to do? Cesar lowered his gaze, shame written across his face. "Because she was pregnant. Julio would never accept his daughter having a child by someone like you. To him, it was a stain on the family name." The ground seemed to give way beneath Pablo. Pregnant. Paloma was pregnant. He had a child. Everything was starting to make sense, but in a cruel, devastating way. "Where is she now? Do you know where he sent her?" Pablo asked, gripping Cesar's arm tightly. "I don't know. Julio used his connections to erase all traces of her. After that, I couldn't stand working for him anymore." Cesar stood up, casting a final worried glance at Pablo. "If you go after Julio, be careful. He already destroyed your life once. He won't hesitate to do it again." Pablo stayed seated, Cesar's words echoing in his mind. The mystery was growing darker, but now he had a new purpose. If he had a child, he would find him. If Paloma was alive, he would uncover where she was. Nothing would stop him from reuniting his family and uncovering the truth. Pablo felt a burning determination inside his chest, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. He didn't know what awaited him ahead, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. The dirt road twisted through the night, the tall trees casting deep shadows under the cold light of the moon. He drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Beside him, Marcelo was scanning a crumpled map, illuminated by the faint glow of his phone. They were heading to a remote place, one of the many discreet properties Julio owned that had remained unnoticed for years. "There it is," Marcelo said, pointing to a rusted gate barely visible in the darkness. Pablo stopped the car and got out, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed the gate open, its creak protesting against the intrusion. They walked down a narrow path that led to a small, run-down house. It didn't look like a luxurious property, but there was something about it that felt intentionally isolated. "Are you sure this is the place?" Pablo asked, turning to Marcelo. "There's no other place." "All signs point here," Marcelo replied with certainty. Pablo approached the door and tested the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed it open carefully, a musty smell of mold and aged wood filling the air. The inside was dark, lit only by the faint light coming through a broken window. The house seemed abandoned, but there was something about it that hinted at buried secrets. "We need to look around," Marcelo said, pulling out a flashlight. The two of them began to explore. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the silence was oppressive. Pablo could feel the weight of the moment, as if every wall was hiding the answers he had been searching for. In a small room at the back, he found something, a wooden chest, locked with a simple padlock leaning against the corner. Pablo used a tool Marcelo had brought to break open the lock. When he opened the chest, a stack of documents fell into his hands. Among contracts and old papers, something made him stop. A set of handwritten letters. He immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Paloma's. With trembling hands, Pablo picked up the first letter and began to read. The words hit him like a wave, as if traveling through time to reach him. "Pablo, my love, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I have to believe you will. I've been kept here against my will. My father forced me to come to this place, saying it was for my own good. I'm pregnant, Pablo. Our child is growing inside me, and he knows. He wants to erase you from my life, erase our story, but I will never forget you." Tears threatened to fall as he read the letters one by one. Each word was more painful than the last. Paloma described her isolation, her daily struggle to hold on to her sanity, and her unwavering love for him. She also told how Julio had forced her to assume a new identity, to disappear completely. Marcelo watched in silence, feeling the weight of her words. "She tried to reach you, Pablo. All of this was to tear you apart," Marcelo said, his voice thick with indignation. Among the papers there was more evidence of Julio's schemes, suspicious bank transfers, forged contracts, orders to cover up the accident that had turned Pablo's life upside down. These weren't just proof against Julio. They were a glimpse into the labyrinth of lies he had woven. Pablo clutched the letters tightly, his chest tight with a mix of grief and fury. The image of Paloma, alone and fighting against a system controlled by her own father, pushed him forward. He knew he couldn't stop now. Paloma was alive, he had a child, and Julio Vieira would pay for everything he had done. As they left the house, Marcelo carrying the box of documents, Pablo looked up at the starry sky. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a real reason to fight. Paloma's letters weren't just proof of her love, they were a call to action, and he would answer that call no matter what lay ahead. As the car tires hummed against the asphalt, Pablo drove toward the neighboring town, his heart pounding like it was trying to break the heavy silence that filled the vehicle. Marcelo was going over the details they had uncovered. Paloma was living under the name Beatriz Oliveira, married to Vitor Mendonça, a respected businessman. A new life built on lies, but still, she was alive. They arrived at a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and immaculate houses. Marcelo parked discreetly, just a few meters from the house they had traced. Pablo sat still, staring at the brick house, the lights inside casting shadows moving behind the curtains. "You ready?" Marcelo asked, watching the tension on Pablo's face. "I'll never be ready, but I need to do this," Pablo replied, getting out of the car. Before everything had gone wrong, Paloma had said something to him. "Gael, before we go any further, you need to meet your son. Pablo, I know this won't be easy, but he deserves to know who you are." The mere thought of meeting Gael left Pablo in a whirlwind of emotions. He knew the boy had grown up believing Victor was his father. Entering his life now would mean destroying that reality. But to remain a stranger to his own son, that was unbearable. The next afternoon, Paloma took Pablo to the park where Gael used to play. From a distance, Pablo saw the boy for the first time. Messy brown hair, curious eyes, and an infectious energy as he ran after a ball. Pablo's heart clenched. He wanted to rush over, pick him up and tell him everything, but he knew he needed to be patient. "I'll introduce you as a friend," Paloma said. "It's the best we can do for now." Gael ran up to them, holding the ball. "Mom, who's he?" he asked, pointing at Pablo. Paloma smiled, but her eyes were heavy with emotion. "This is Pablo, an old friend of mine." Pablo crouched down to Gael's level. "Hey there, champ. You like soccer?" Gael nodded enthusiastically, starting to talk about the soccer games he watched and his own skills. Little by little, the conversation flowed. Pablo felt an instant connection, but he also knew that he had to earn the boy's trust. Over the following days, Pablo continued to get closer to Gael, showing up consistently without revealing the full truth. The relationship started off tense, with Gael hesitating to open up. But slowly, through small daily interactions, a bridge began to form between them. Gael, over time, started to admire Pablo, seeing something in him that he had never seen in Victor: honesty and genuine attention. Meanwhile, the plan to take down Julio was in motion, and the air was thick with tension, but also a growing sense of strength. Marcelo, with his skills and connections, had secured surveillance equipment and escape routes. Paloma, in turn, focused on mapping out every corner of the farm, gathering detailed information about where the most secretive files were kept. They all knew this wasn't just a game, it was a matter of life and death. Julio always thought he had everything under control, but he has no idea what we're capable of when we're united, Paloma said, her voice firm, almost defiant. Pablo looked at her and at Marcelo, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the relief of having true allies by his side. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was a fight to reclaim his life and to protect his son's future. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The light from Julio's farm gleamed in the darkness of the night, but behind that calm facade, something sinister was about to unfold. Julio already knew about Pablo and Paloma's movements. His informants had tipped him off about Marcelo's actions and the focus on the compromising documents. His anger was palpable. He knew that to keep his empire intact, and most importantly, to keep control over Paloma and Gael, he had to act quickly. The next morning, Paloma's phone rang. Julio's voice on the other end made her stomach churn. "You're messing with something dangerous, Paloma," he said coldly. "I thought it was clear what would happen if you betrayed me. Are you willing to risk losing Gael? Because if you keep this up, he won't be safe." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Paloma's feet. Fear tried to take over for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of anger. For all these years, she had bowed to Julio's will, but now she felt a different kind of strength. With trembling hands, she hung up the phone and rushed to find Pablo and Marcelo. When she arrived at the inn, her pale face gave away the severity of the situation. Julio knows what we're doing. He threatened to take Gael away from me," she said, struggling to hold back tears. Pablo stood up immediately, his face hardening. "He's not going to touch our son, not this time. Marcelo, we need to reinforce the security around Paloma and Gael right now." Marcelo was already grabbing his phone, his mind working quickly to figure out the next steps. I'll talk to some contacts at the station. We can't involve too many people. Julio's power is too great, but there are still those who are on our side. As Marcelo worked to ensure Paloma and Gail's safety, Pablo and Paloma stepped away to plan their next move. I know you're scared, Paloma, but we have to stay calm. Julio is trying to intimidate us because he knows we're close to taking him down. Paloma looked at Pablo, and something in her gaze began to change. Determination was slowly replacing the fear. I won't let him win again. Gael is everything to me. And now I know we're not alone in this. Did you enjoy today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.